Horror is a staple of internet fiction, and it has been for a long time. A lot of my earliest memories of really and truly enjoying horror didn't come from movies, games, or even books. They came from the stories I read online. See, when you're a kid, and especially a sheltered one like myself, it's hard to access a lot of mainstream horror. My parents were very strict when it came to what I was allowed to consume, and with horror, there wasn't a lot of wiggle room. Horror movies were almost completely inaccessible. We didn't really have any horror DVDs or other physical copies around the house, and I knew that if I tried to watch something on any of the family streaming services, they'd find out pretty quickly. Look, strict parents create sneaky kids, but I didn't figure out how to get around those kinds of restrictions until much later in my life. Unless I paid for it myself, I couldn't really find a way to watch scary movies, and I definitely didn't have a steady source of income when I was 12, much less a card to do anything with it. So I got really into reading. To be fair, I was already into reading, but now I had a new goal: to find that terror I was seeking out through whatever means I could. Honestly, I'm not sure what my parents were thinking, setting such high restrictions for movies while allowing me full access to the plethora of written horror. I may have mentioned it in another video, but reading certainly did the job. I got plenty of nightmares from reading horror. Authors like Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, Stephen King, Clive Barker, and plenty of others I became familiar with way earlier than I had any right to. And quite honestly, I think I was a little too young for the stories. Not because of how graphic or scary they were, but because they were written for a more experienced and mature audience. Subtlety was lost on me. I got bored sometimes, and I was too fresh in the world to understand the nuance and implications of certain scenes. That never stopped me, but it did push me in another interesting direction. You see, when you're a little horror freak looking for something that's actually going to scare you, you might gravitate towards someone like King or Poe just off of name recognition. I've never been afraid of clowns, but I read It because I was familiar with the reputation of the story. Now, do I like It? For sure, it's a classic for a reason, but the book is also really long, over 1,000 pages. In my old age of 21, I have no problem with a book of that length, and in fact, some of my favorite books get into that area, but as an ADHD kid who did not get a grip on it until maybe ever, you can understand how some of the impact was lessened. I was in an awkward position, desperate for more of the only kind of horror I could consume at the time, but unclear on where to get it from. And then I saw this photo. Or maybe it was this one. For the life of me, I can't remember where I saw them first. In all likelihood, it was a childhood friend who showed them to me, one of the kids whose parents were a little more lenient with what they were allowed to see, but it doesn't matter where I got it. What matters is that it struck me immediately. This photo, for the few of you who don't know, is of a fictional entity known as Slender Man. It was a submission made to a 2009 Something Awful photo competition by a user known, at the time, as Victor Surge. What is Slender Man? Well, that's kind of the question, isn't it? The photos he was originally depicted in are old-looking, blurry. They don't give much away about the character. All we can tell is that he's tall, slender, obviously, and faceless. In one of the photos, it looks like he might have something emerging from his back, dark black tendrils, but it's hard to tell from the distance. The original Slenderman photos are so compelling because they're full of eerie questions and unsettling implications. Why does it seem like he gravitates towards children? He's surrounded by kids, but none of them seem to notice he's there, and yet, is he staring into the camera? In both scenes, he's oddly facing us, presenting himself as if unconcerned with the notion of being seen. Why doesn't he have a face? What is Slender Man? In my desperate attempt to discover more about the strange figure, I took to the internet, and through my research, I stumbled upon one of the greatest treasure troves of horror fiction out there. I discovered creepypastas. The term creepypasta is a play on copypasta, a word which refers to a block of text which is copied and pasted in different places around the internet. The inclusion of the word creepy tells us everything we need to know. Creepypastas are unsettling and frightening blocks of text which are shared over the internet. They can range from short campfire stories and urban legends to long-form fiction. Some creepypastas receiving multiple entries and chapters, others developing far enough to be produced into a book, series, or even movie. Slender Man got his own movie in 2018, but let's not talk about that. The first officially recognized creepypasta was released in 2001 and was called Ted the Caver. It was written as a series of blog posts by a fictional man named Ted who had discovered a mysterious cave with his friend and was slowly documenting his excavation process. As things moved forward, the pair began encountering strange winds and hieroglyphs before beginning to fall victim to hallucinations and nightmares. The blog kind of ended in the middle of things, implying that something awful happened to Ted. Being the first entry in what would become a massive collection of tales, Ted the Caver doesn't do a lot of things that the most popular creepypastas are known for, most strikingly including a tangible antagonist. Sure, the cave itself is probably the real villain of the story, but in comparison to some of the other names that would soon appear in the genre, it's incredibly muted and subtle as a villain. Subtlety was not the goal for creepypastas back in the day. They were violent, edgy, and clearly aimed towards a younger audience. It's how I was able to connect with them so quickly. They're simple enough to be understood by a pretty young reader, but graphic in a way I hadn't seen before. I often find, rereading some of my favorite old creepypastas, that there's a juvenile voice to the writing. I don't necessarily mean this as an insult or even a criticism, it's just, I'm pretty sure a lot of these stories were written by kids. Certain stories have an overwhelming simplicity to them, or seem full of concepts which are presented or resolved far too quickly to be realistic. It's the authorial voice of someone who deeply loves horror but is still learning what makes horror good, and further, how the world works. One of the greatest and most well-known examples of this is a story written in 2011 by DeviantArt user Susur. Seswar, something like that. You see, in the early days of creepypasta, the thing that guaranteed you the most success was having a standout villain. It wasn't enough to just tell a good horror story, you were banking on having a character who fan artists would draw obsessively, who other writers would use in their own stories, the kind of character that would encapsulate the energy of your story by name alone. That's why one of the most popular creepypasta characters of all time has one of the goofiest names of all time. Jeff the Killer. Jeff the Killer. Look, it's hard coming up with names for horror characters. You want something that's going to stick in the mind, but isn't too similar to another idea, so writers tend to fall into one of two methods. Describing the character fully by what they are, like Pinhead, who has pins in his head, or by making up a completely new name and rolling the dice on whether that name is stupid, like the people who named the Bye-Bye Man. Clearly, Susur decided to go with the first option, but made a critical mistake in choosing the name Jeff. Jeff is not the name of a killer, even though it literally is the first name of one of the most deranged serial killers of all time, Jeffrey Dahmer. But notice how he goes by Jeffrey, and also that he was a real person. Any name could have preceded the killer, so it's a little funny that the name the author landed on was so basic. But that's neither here nor there. The story of Jeff the Killer is interesting. Essentially, after moving into a new neighborhood with his parents and his brother, Jeff, a child who is apparently 13, though it's never explicitly stated, begins being bullied by a group of kids. The story tries to imply that there's something wrong with Jeff, hidden beneath the surface, but it's a little unclear what that something is. The language used in the story is not super descriptive and kinda just confuses you. Jeff sometimes feels something weird. It's not painful or bad, just weird, and he feels it. How does this feeling manifest? What triggers it? Does he have control over it? Who knows? Certainly not Jeff. I think the idea is that Jeff has a hidden capacity for violence, which he's only just now starting to become aware of, but nothing about how the scene is actually written makes this overtly clear. Anyway, on his first day of school, Jeff and his brother, Lou, are cornered by those bullies I mentioned, and let me just read an excerpt of how this interaction goes down. Well, 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 it looks like we got some new meat. Suddenly, two other kids appeared. One was super skinny, and the other was huge. Well, since you're new here, I'd like to introduce ourselves. Over there is Keith. Jeff and Lou looked over to the skinny kid. He had a dopey face that you'd expect a sidekick to have. And he's Troy. They looked over at the fat kid. Talk about a tub of lard. This kid looked like he hadn't exercised since he was crawling. And I, said the first kid, am Randy. Now, for all the kids in this neighborhood, there's a small price for bus fare, if you catch my drift. Lou stood up, ready to punch the lights out of this kid's eyes when one of his friends pulled a knife on him. I had hoped you'd be more cooperative, but it seems we must do this the hard way. It doesn't matter how old Randy is. This is just not how kids talk. I got bullied plenty as a kid, and trust me, bullies are not quite so eloquent. Anyway, Jeff is not having it. He grabs a kid's wrist and just breaks it. Doesn't say how he breaks it, he just does. He beats the shit out of all of the kids and even stabs one, Keith, in the arm before running away with Lou. So, the next morning, the cops show up at Jeff's house. For some reason, the cops think that two of the kids got stabbed. I've reread the fight scene and the interrogation a few times, and I have no idea why they think this. As far as I can tell, the series of events during the fight went as follows. Jeff punches Randy in the face, then breaks Randy's wrist. Keith and Troy rush him, and he throws Randy to the ground before dodging Keith and stabbing him in the arm. Then, he punches Troy in the stomach, and the brothers run away. At no point does Jeff stab anyone other than Keith, but the cops say, and I quote, "We found 3 kids, 2 stabbed, 1 having a bruise on his stomach." Of course, implying that the other stabbing victim was Randy, but that never happened. I don't know why they think this. Anyway, Jeff's brother takes the fall with the cops, and they drag him away for a year in juvie. Jeff tries to tell everyone it was him, but no one believes him, and the next day his mom forces him to go to a stranger's birthday party because... I don't know. The bullies show up to the party and start waving guns around, pissed that Jeff beat them up the other day. Note that Randy is unstabbed in this scene, so what the fuck were those cops talking about? So anyway, Randy breaks a bottle of vodka over Jeff's 13-year-old head somehow, and Jeff snaps. He punches Randy in the heart, stopping it, and Randy dies. Keith and Troy chase him upstairs, where he maybe kills Troy, or at least knocks him out, before getting into a tussle with Keith. A bottle of bleach falls on the two of them, and Jeff bonks Keith so hard in the head that he starts bleeding to death. Keith is just fine with dying, I guess, because he laughs and points out that Jeff is covered in alcohol and bleach. Bleach is not flammable, by the way, so I'm not 100% sure why that part is included, but either way, Keith sets Jeff on fire. In the hospital the next day, Lou has been released from juvie, which makes sense after everyone saw Jeff almost get murdered. Jeff is deformed, his skin pale, his hair black, his lips dark and red. Clearly, he's gone insane at this point. He's laughing at everything and seems super unstable. So, the hospital obviously releases him, and that night, he carves his face like Heath Ledger's The Joker and burns his eyelids off. The last thing we read is Jeff gutting his parents, then killing his brother while saying, "Go to sleep," which has become an iconic line for the character. And that's the story! So now's the moment I have to admit that I really liked Jeff the Killer when I first read about him. The photo attached to the story is unsettling and well known. The violence felt so adult, the way the character's personality shifted, it really worked for me. Upon a second reading, though, there are clearly some issues. The story is written like the author had a place to be in 15 minutes. We move from one event to the next so quickly that there's hardly any time to process what happened just a minute ago. No character is adequately fleshed out, and the murder of Jeff's family literally takes only 2 paragraphs. And yet, this story is beloved. It worked for me and thousands of others. Were those others probably also kids? Without a doubt, but that was the appeal. It was a character who made sense to young audiences because he was almost certainly designed by a young writer. Jeff became a legendary figure among creepypasta fans, with seemingly infinite fan art and further additions to his story down the line. Jeff started a trend of character design which was super recognizable back in the early 2010s. After the success of his story, an influx of dark-clothed, murderous white boys poured into the community, with some exceptions like Jane the Killer, who was a dark-clothed, murderous white girl who got retconned into Jeff's history. It seemed like the formula was now to simply write violent and emotionally unhinged characters, and that would be enough. We started seeing characters like Tiki Toby, Eyeless Jack, and also Laughing Jack. The names of these characters are so weird to me. Toby, Jane, Jack twice, and of course, Jeff. These aren't the names of serial killers, they're the names of my bowling squad. They're so normal, and maybe that was the point? But not every creepypasta was about murderers. At least, not entirely. For a period of time in the community, the most popular form of storytelling was taking a familiar and usually beloved franchise and making it dark and twisted. There's any number I can pull off the top of my head. Sonic.exe, Squidward Suicide, SuicideMouse.avi. Creepypasta writers really got into having beloved characters commit unalive in their stories. It's a natural trope to fall into. We get so accustomed to seeing characters like Squidward, Mickey Mouse, or Sonic in kid-friendly situations that it seems only natural to twist those stories for good horror. A lot of stories follow this trend, with varying degrees of success, but none capture the horror so effectively as Ben Drowned. Ben Drowned is based around the game Majora's Mask, a slightly darker sequel to The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Already, Majora's Mask is a game steeped in spookiness. The story, the sound design, the enemies, all of them carry a strange, nameless weight with them, like a secret was baked into the code of the game, one that was desperate to be known. Ben Drowned pushed this feeling a little further. Essentially, while browsing at a garage sale, our protagonist discovers a copy of the game Majora's Mask, which used to belong to someone named Ben, though where Ben is now is unknown to the protagonist. I'm willing to bet you can guess what happened to Ben. When the protagonist begins playing the game, he quickly realizes there's something off about it. There are pre-existing saves that don't make sense. The characters in the game seem stilted and afraid in a way they were not in the original, and most strikingly, the protagonist keeps finding himself stalked by a grinning statue of Link. Over time, the experiences of the protagonist become more and more overtly wrong, until the realization finally hits that somehow, the previous owner of this game now inhabits it. A lot happens in Ben Drowned, and it's written a lot more thoughtfully than Jeff the Killer, so I won't go through it point by point. It's probably worth a read still, and if you're not interested in that, Nexpo made a great cinematic video about it a couple years ago. The biggest thing that stands out about Ben Drowned isn't its writing, though. It's the included media. See, around this time, creepypastas started trying to include their audience in their universes. It wasn't enough to just talk about a weird game you found. Now, that game had to be a playable part of the story. Many fan games were produced like this, several interpretations of Sonic.exe or the Mario ROM hack. Creepypastas weren't just about writing anymore. They were multimedia. The videos included in Ben Drowned set the tone incredibly well. It's clear whoever was working on them was incredibly proficient as a coder or modder or whatever it took. In each clip, it was clearly Majora's Mask being played, with all the right sound effects and textures, but additionally there was warping. Text was scrambled, characters bent into unsettling positions, and, of course, that ever-following statue. The horror was made that much greater by a competent creator. Alongside Ben Drowned was another very famous story that wanted you to believe it was real. The last creepypasta I'm going to talk about today is Smile Dog. Smile Dog is, perhaps, one of the most iconic creepypastas of all time. Mostly because its story is founded on the effects produced by an image. The idea of the story is that there's a picture which exists out in the world of a dog. He's looking directly at the camera with a shockingly human smile. To his right, there appears to be a human hand reaching out, though why, we can't say. Weirdly enough, there are actually two primary photos that people tend to use for Smile Dog. For reasons that are unclear to me, in one version, the dog looks like a husky with human teeth, and in the other version, the dog looks like a fucking demon. Whichever photo you choose to imagine as the real one, though, the lore of the photo is that upon viewing, you'll become cursed by the dog, who will haunt you and force you to spread the image to other people under threat of death. Honestly, it's a simple premise, comparable to the plot of stuff like The Ring or It Follows. It's a curse that self-perpetuates, forces the character to become an accessory to the horror of the situation, giving it knowingly to other people. Smile Dog is one of the greats. There are a bunch of well-known creepypastas that I didn't cover in this video, as well as creepypasta characters. If you grew up in the community, you're probably mad I didn't talk about The Rake, or The Russian Sleep Experiment, or even Herobrine. But that doesn't mean I won't in the future. Creepypastas were a huge part of my life growing up, and I'd love to talk about more of the popular ones in the future, as well as how the medium has shifted and changed over time. Who knows, maybe this video will be part 1 in a larger series. But until then, you'll have to make do with the many other YouTubers talking about or narrating creepypastas. I know, it sucks waiting for your favorite YouTuber to make another video, but it's getting a little late. The moon's pretty high in the sky now, and there's no telling what's creeping around out there, so why don't you just go to sleep?